And if the calculation in Washington was that this kind of a confrontation with Russia would consolidate the unity of the Western powers and also strengthen their transatlantic leadership, there may be unpleasant surprises in the period ahead. Have a lot of background. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration or the disbandment of the Soviet Union, I was a diplomat serving in Moscow at the time. And I recall at the beginning, let me mention this from my memory, a conversation with an American colleague in the embassy circuit. He asked me, how much time do you think you will give Russia to rise again? I was quite taken aback because like a lot of us, I never imagined that the Soviet Union would collapse the way it did. In India also, we never expected the collapse of the Soviet Union the way it did. But it's important to know that there were people who were looking beyond this, and at a certain near conceivable future where the Russian power would resurrect. Of course, this is quite in sync with Russian history, where like a phoenix, it had risen from ashes many a time. And it was entirely conceivable that this was not going to be the end of Russian history. But, you know, what it showed is that there was a certain kind of mental framework, even at that time, existing as to how to cut down Russia, how to prepare for this eventuality of the resurgence of Russia on the global stage. And like Madeleine Albright once said, why should one country have so much of excessive resources and such a large landmass? This is not fair. You see, this is the kind of perspective that was there, that has been there on Russia for over a century. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this thought was very much there that this entity would be a permanent challenge unless it is cut down to size once and for all to American supremacy hegemony. Now, therefore, you know, the crux of the matter is here, more than anything else, there are several templates at work here today in this situation, in this crisis in Ukraine. But the most important thing is this, that Russia's existence, Russia's resurgence as a global power, which can destroy the United States, which has a thermonuclear capability to destroy the United States. And therefore, Russia is a different case altogether from the American point of view. Secondly, the resources, you know, we are now seeing it is right now playing out in front of us that, you know, a country with such a resource base, phenomenally endowed, you know, in mineral resources and so on, it cannot be tackled easily, you know, because it has a kind of a autonomy by its birthright, what nature has bestowed on it. So this is the other uniqueness of the Russian challenge for the US. So what is coming up now, that the number one threat for the United States is Russia. This has always been there in the last 30 years or so, even after the disbandment of the Soviet Union. So this is one template, you know, that we have to keep in mind, because the Ukraine crisis is very complicated for this reason, that we outsiders look at it from a geopolitical perspective. But for Russia, this is an existential struggle. Russia cannot afford to lose, because this is an existential struggle for Russia. Putin himself has said that we are with our back against the wall. there is really no space to retreat. That is the stark reality. Particularly, the next 100 days are going to be extremely dangerous because the Western narrative about the Ukraine war doesn't hold together any longer. Even in the Western media, even in the American media, even in the New York Times, there is a grudging acknowledgement that the Russian operation is on course, and it's far from a situation that Russia can be defeated. In fact, more and more candidly, Western journalists are writing that Ukraine cannot win this war. This is not really about Ukraine. It's democracy against authoritarianism and so on. But this is really speaking is not that way. And now in the coming period, now that the Americans realize that putting down the Russians, defeating them is not going to be possible, they are trying to extend it, and they're trying to weaken Russia to the extent possible. And now a second aspect is that they are giving weaponry to Russia, to Ukraine, which can hit Russia. But there is a whole history available to us in this respect about Ukrainians finally acting on their own, in their interests. You know, there are wheels within wheels in this situation. So you see, this is a matter of time, I fear, that they might use these weapons to, because there is a certain revenge mentality as far as the Ukrainian nationalist forces are concerned, which goes back to Second World War and even beyond that, you know, and it's very deeply embedded. We are on a very dangerous situation today. And therefore, when we look at, the point I'm making is when we look at the post-conflict situation or the impact of this on the world order, we tend to overlook that there are this is a very dangerous situation today, and there are many variables at work here. You know, it's very significant. Russians do not call this a war; they call it a special operation. They have said repeatedly that there is no timeline. They have objectives, but they have no timeline. So we need to, first point I need to mention is this, that we need to look beyond this, beyond the conflict. When we look at the situation beyond the conflict, how it impacts on the world order, everything depends on how the military situation evolves. Secondly, it has been mentioned by the just earlier that the European situation is getting complicated. Evidently, a very serious error was there in their judgment that they could have a sort of punitive sanctions from hell, and destroy Russia and can get away with it. Russia was, of course, very well prepared, and Russia had maintained also that this is not going to be such an easy thing. There will be repercussions, and it will come as a shock, and it is coming. Even in America, there is a repercussions of this sanctions thing, the distortions that have introduced into the interdependency between Europe and Russia on energy matters, particularly. This is a kind of situation that is developing. Energy, gasoline price in the United States, which is very important for an American in his day-to-day life, a factor. Then there is the election coming up in America, so the compulsions on President Biden in the coming period. All this taken into account, the Western world is also in turmoil as a result of it. And at the same time, they are not in a position to retreat from that. But partly we are seeing a certain grudging realization that some places there has to be a retreat, like Americans are contemplating a moderation of the sanctions regime so that wheat and food grains can flow from Russia to the world market. So it's a specific instance, but at the same time, it's a realization that the food crisis that is developing in the world is polemics apart, that you can attribute everything to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there is a realization that the sanctions have got something to do with this. So you see, this is how long this can continue like this remains to be seen. There are certain cracks in the Western unity which are visible. Even within the European Union, the difficulty in coming to a consensus on oil embargo against Russia is the best illustration of that. So this will only deepen in the period ahead. And if the calculation in Washington was that this kind of a confrontation with Russia would consolidate the unity of the Western powers and also strengthen their transatlantic leadership, there may be unpleasant surprises in the period ahead. For the Americans, a defeat in Ukraine will mean that their decline will accelerate, and a re-establishment of their hegemony will be out of the question. It will be finished once and for all. And their leadership of the Western alliance, the NATO's future, all these are factors involved in it. So the struggle ahead is going to be extremely serious. If, on the other hand, if Russia asserts and Russia prevails in Ukraine, many of these wonderful thoughts that we listened to earlier, these will prevail also in terms of a multipolar world order, in terms of a break from the dollar supremacy and the kind of tyranny that the United States has exercised through weaponization of sanctions, appropriating the wealth of other countries unilaterally without any regard for international law, without even caring to justify that act. All these things will become very difficult, and we will be then moving toward a much more democratized world order where big and small countries all will have equal rights, and it will be difficult for any single power to force its will on the world community.